August 2nd, 1990. Before most Americans had finished their morning coffee, 100,000 Iraqi troops and 700 tanks crossed the border into Kuwait. By noon, the country was gone. In less than 12 hours, Saddam Hussein had seized control of roughly 10% of the world's known oil reserves. Within days, the price of a gallon of gas at every Exxon and Shell station in America jumped nearly 25%. Grocery bills followed, heating oil followed, airline tickets followed. The American economy, 270 million people going about their lives in houses and cars and factories, flinched in a single morning because a dictator in the Middle East had taken a country that most Americans couldn't find on a map. The United States sent 700,000 troops to the Persian Gulf. More than 1,500 were wounded. 383 never came home. The bill, in today's dollars, ran past $100 billion. And that was just one war. One of at least a dozen in the 20th century alone, where oil was the reason soldiers were dying, borders were being redrawn, and governments were being toppled. The thing that caused all of that, you probably drove past it this morning. You definitely paid for it this week. It's underneath the asphalt on every American highway. It's inside every plastic bottle in your fridge. It's in the engine of every car, in every Walmart parking lot, in every state in this country. This is the story of oil. This is where it begins. Long before the first oil well was ever drilled, long before the first combustion engine was ever built, long before a single gas station existed anywhere on Earth, oil was already here. It seeped out of the ground on its own. Black, thick, slow-moving, smelling like something between tar and rotting wood. In the valleys of what is now western Pennsylvania, the Seneca people, one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who had occupied those lands for thousands of years before any European arrived, had been collecting it from the surface of creeks and streams for centuries. They skimmed it off the water with blankets. They burned it. They used it as medicine, rubbing it on skin conditions and joint pain. They traded it. The Seneca were not alone. In what is now Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, crude oil had been seeping naturally from the ground for at least 6,000 years. The Sumerians, one of the earliest complex civilizations in human history, had a word for it: Idu. They used it to waterproof baskets and boats and as mortar between the bricks of their buildings. The ancient city of Babylon, built centuries before the Roman Empire, thousands of years before the United States was even a concept, was held together in part with bitumen, with petroleum, with oil. Think about the scale of that for a second. People were building with oil-based materials 4,000 years before the United States existed as a country. When Nebuchadnezzar II was constructing the walls of Babylon, walls so massive that ancient historians counted them among the wonders of the world, he was using the same raw material that fills the gas tank in your driveway right now. In ancient China, as early as 600 BC, engineers drilling for salt accidentally struck oil and natural gas. Chinese workers using bamboo pipe were pumping petroleum from the earth more than 2,600 years ago. Some of the gas they found burned for years inside bamboo conduits, fueling evaporation operations. This was not curiosity. This was industry. In the 7th century AD, the Byzantine Empire weaponized oil, Greek fire, a burning liquid that stuck to everything it touched and could not be extinguished by water, was almost certainly a petroleum compound. Byzantine warships sprayed it on enemy fleets. It burned on the surface of the sea. Sailors who jumped overboard to escape their burning ships drowned in burning water. We still don't have the exact formula. The Byzantines kept it a state secret for centuries. But the core ingredient? The same black, thick liquid the Seneca was skimming off Pennsylvania creeks. For most of human history, oil was a curiosity, a nuisance, a useful sealant. a folk remedy. Nobody, not even the most sophisticated civilization on Earth, had any idea of what was sitting underneath the ground. The moment that changed everything happened not in the Middle East, not in Central Asia, but in Western Pennsylvania. And it happened in 1859. Edwin Drake was, by any reasonable measure, an unlikely revolutionary. He had worked as a railroad conductor. He had no training in geology, no background in chemistry or engineering. A New Haven businessman named George Bissell had sent him to Titusville, Pennsylvania, a small timber and farming town in the northwest corner of the state, to figure out if the oil seeping from the ground there could be extracted in useful quantities. Drake drilled. He used the same technique salt well drillers used, and on August 27, 1859, at a depth of 69 feet, he struck oil. The yield that first day was roughly 35 barrels. By modern standards, that's nothing. The Permian Basin in West Texas produces millions of barrels a day, but in 1859, those 35 barrels launched an industry that would, within 100 years, become the largest and most powerful in the history of human civilization. Within months of Drake's well, Titusville was overwhelmed. Speculators arrived from Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York. Drillers punched holes into every available piece of land. The price of land in Titusville went from a few dollars an acre to hundreds of dollars an acre practically overnight. A single good well could produce more money in a week than a farmer made in a year. Men who had been dirt poor in January were millionaires by October. Men who had been millionaires in October were bankrupt by Christmas because overproduction drove prices through the floor. In the early 1860s, crude oil prices swung from $10 a barrel to 10 cents a barrel in less than a year. The economic logic of oil was becoming clear, and it was unlike any commodity the world had ever seen. Whoever controlled the supply controlled everything downstream. The refiner controlled the lamp oil that lit American homes. The pipeline owner controlled where crude could go. The railroad that carried the barrels controlled who could sell. Oil was not just a product, it was leverage. By 1865, American oil production was already over 3 million barrels per year. By 1870, it had tripled. The industry was not just taking root, it was metastasizing. The moment oil became too important to stay local came almost immediately after Drake's first strike. The stuff had to be moved, refined, and sold. The geography of western Pennsylvania, landlocked, hilly, with no navigable rivers going the right direction, meant that whoever could solve the logistics problem of moving oil would control the industry. That problem attracted a 21-year-old bookkeeper from Cleveland, Ohio, who had been watching the chaos of the oil fields from a distance. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and he would not be watching from a distance for long. By the time John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil of Ohio in 1870, he had already identified the fundamental weakness of the oil industry. It was anarchic. Thousands of independent drillers, hundreds of competing refiners, dozens of rival pipelines, all of them cutting each other's throats, all of them making the business unstable. Rockefeller looked at this chaos and saw not a problem but an opportunity. He decided he was going to bring order to it, his order. The strategy he used was called horizontal integration. He didn't drill for oil, he refined it. And he made secret deals with the railroads, specifically the Lakeshore Railroad and the New York Central, to receive massive rebates on shipping costs that his competitors never knew existed. For every barrel his rivals shipped, they paid full price. Rockefeller paid a fraction. Then those same railroads paid Rockefeller a cut of what his competitors paid. He was being paid to undercut the people he was crushing. The scale of what followed is almost impossible to grasp without an American comparison. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of all U.S. oil refining. 90%. Imagine one company controlling 90% of every gas station, every pipeline, every refinery in the United States today. That was Standard Oil. The company operated across 20 states. It had its own intelligence network, employees who reported on competitors' movements, who intercepted business communications, who bought out rivals or starved them until they surrendered. The wealth was physical and visible. By 1913, Rockefeller's personal fortune was estimated at roughly $900 million, equivalent to somewhere between 25 and 30 billion in today's dollars. He was, at that point, the wealthiest private individual in American history, and possibly in the history of the world to that point. But oil wasn't just moving inside America. The British, the Germans, the Dutch, the Russians, everyone with any capacity to drill and ship was entering the game. In the late 1870s, the Nobel brothers, yes, the family behind the Nobel Prize, had begun drilling in Baku, Azerbaijan, on the shores of the Caspian Sea. By the 1880s, Baku was producing more oil than the entire United States. Russian oil moved through a brand new pipeline over the Caucasus Mountains down to the Black Sea port of Batumi and onto tanker ships headed for European markets. In Southeast Asia, a Dutch company was tapping the oil fields of Sumatra and Borneo. A British company called Burma Oil was drilling in Burma. Shell Transport, named for the decorative seashells the Marcus Samuel family originally sold, pivoted into oil transport and began competing directly with Standard Oil for Asian markets. The world was being carved up, not by soldiers yet, by pipeline routes and shipping contracts and secret rebate agreements, and somewhere in the background, a technology was being developed in Europe that would make everything that came before look like a prologue. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shaped the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. Every week, something new. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, or somewhere in between, I genuinely want to know where these stories end up landing. All right, back to it. Because this is where the stakes get a lot higher. John D. Rockefeller didn't just build a company, he built a system. And understanding how that system worked explains almost everything that came after. By the 1880s, Standard Oil had achieved something no private company in American history had ever achieved before or has achieved since. Effective control over an entire essential industry, from the ground to the consumer. Standard owned the wells, or controlled the pricing from wells it didn't own. Standard owned the pipelines. Standard owned the refineries. Standard owned the railroad tank cars. Standard owned the marketing companies that sold refined product to consumers. If you wanted to participate in the American oil industry and Standard Oil decided you weren't welcome, you were finished. The mechanism of control was elegant and brutal. Standard would approach an independent refiner and offer to buy them out. If the refiner refused, Standard would immediately cut prices in that refiner's market below the cost of production, sustain those losses using profits from markets where it had no competition, and wait for the independent to go bankrupt. Then they'd buy the assets out of bankruptcy for pennies. This wasn't illegal at the time. There were no antitrust laws. Standard was operating within the rules of American capitalism. It was just operating within those rules in ways nobody had ever thought to use before. Standard Oil's profits in 1879 were roughly $19 million, and that's somewhere north of 580 million in today's dollars in a single year from oil. When Rockefeller reorganized Standard into a trust in 1882, a legal structure that allowed him to centrally control dozens of technically independent companies, the trust controlled assets worth more than the entire annual budget of the US federal government at the time, one private company, more capital than the United States government. By the mid-1880s, Standard had laid more than 4,000 miles of pipeline across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, a distance roughly equal to driving from Philadelphia to Denver without once getting off the highway. No barrel of oil moved through that region without Standard knowing about it. No price was set without Standard's approval. The American consequence of Standard's dominance is still visible today. The Supreme Court's breakup of Standard Oil in 1911 created 34 successor companies. Exxon was originally Standard Oil of New Jersey. Mobil was Standard Oil of New York. Chevron was Standard Oil of California. Amoco was Standard Oil of Indiana. The company that Rockefeller built a century ago still powers your car, heats your house, and runs every piece of plastic packaging in your pantry. The empire was formally dissolved. The bloodline survived. The early oil industry was one of the most dangerous working environments in American history. And the people who did the actual work, the roughnecks, the tool dressers, the roustabouts, are almost entirely absent from the story we usually tell. In the Pennsylvania oil fields of the 1860s and 1870s, the work was physically savage. Wells were drilled using a cable tool method. A heavy iron bit, sometimes weighing 2,500 pounds, was raised and dropped repeatedly onto rock below, sometimes thousands of times a day, while workers managed the machinery and stood close enough that a single mechanical failure could kill them. Blowouts, sudden releases of pressurized oil or gas were common and frequently fatal. When they happened, the gas could ignite instantly. An oil field that was a going concern at 9 in the morning could be a column of black fire a quarter-mile high by noon. The death rate in early American oil field work was staggering. Estimates from state labor records in Pennsylvania and Ohio suggest that fatal accident rates in oil and gas work ran at roughly 50 to 100 deaths per 1,000 workers per year in the worst periods of the 1860s and 1870s. To put that in American terms, if the entire city of Dayton, Ohio, had worked in the Pennsylvania oil fields for a decade under those conditions, you would have expected between 5,000 and 10,000 fatalities, just from accidents, not from disease, not from poverty. Just from showing up, the workers who survived the physical danger faced an entirely different threat: economic precarity engineered by the people above them. Independent producers, the men who actually drilled the wells, were systematically squeezed by Standard Oil's control of pipelines and railroads. When Standard cut the rates it paid producers for crude, producers had no alternative. You couldn't sell to someone else because Standard controlled how your oil got to market. The choice was Standard's price or nothing. Hundreds of small oil men went bankrupt between 1870 and 1900, not because they failed to find oil, but because they found it and couldn't get paid for it. Across the Atlantic, the labor story was worse. The oil fields of Baku, Azerbaijan, which by the 1890s had briefly surpassed the United States as the world's largest oil producer, ran on something close to industrial serfdom. Hundreds of thousands of migrant workers from the Caucasus and Central Asia worked the Baku fields in conditions that drew comparisons, even at the time, to the worst industrial sites in Europe. The air around the derricks was thick with petroleum fumes and smoke from burning waste gas. Skin diseases from constant oil exposure were near universal. Workers lived in company barracks, bought food from company stores, and were paid wages that barely covered the costs the company charged them to live. American factories and American households were not the direct end destination of Baku oil. It went to European markets, but American refiners were competing directly with Baku oil for those same markets, which meant that the brutal labor conditions in Azerbaijan were shaping the pricing pressure that American oil workers faced every day. Don't moralize yet, just hold the math. Somebody paid for the cheap oil. It wasn't the companies. The first time oil directly changed the map of the world, most Americans didn't notice. It happened in 1908, in a place called Masjid Soliman in southwestern Iran. A British drilling operation had been searching for oil in Persia for 7 years, spending what would be roughly $20 million in today's dollars, and finding almost nothing. They had nearly given up. Then, at 4 in the morning on May 26, 1908, oil came roaring up from a depth of 1,180 feet. The British government, which had quietly acquired a controlling stake in the drilling operation and reorganized it into what became the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed British Petroleum, then BP, had just secured the energy source that would power the Royal Navy through 2 world wars. That single well, in a country most Americans couldn't have found on a map in 1908, set in motion a chain of events that would eventually cost American taxpayers trillions of dollars, reshape the Middle East, and create the political conditions that led to September 11, 2001. Between 1914 and 1945, oil was a decisive factor in almost every major military campaign. Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 was driven in large part by the need for petroleum. Germany had virtually none of its own. The drive toward the Caucasus oil fields at Baku produced some of the most catastrophic fighting of the entire war. The German Sixth Army, advancing toward the oil, was destroyed at Stalingrad. Historians estimate that somewhere between 2 and 3 million soldiers from both sides died in campaigns directly tied to Germany's oil strategy in the Soviet Union. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the event that brought the United States into World War II, was driven explicitly by oil. The United States had cut off Japan's oil supply in July 1941 after Japan invaded Indochina. Japan had less than 2 years of reserves. The military calculated that the only way to access the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was to destroy the American Pacific Fleet first. That calculation produced Pearl Harbor. The war that killed more than 400,000 Americans happened because of oil, and the peace that followed wasn't much cleaner. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence jointly executed a covert operation, codenamed Operation Ajax, that overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. His crime? He had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which had been extracting Iranian oil for decades and paying Iran a fraction of its market value. A CIA officer named Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, organized the coup from inside Tehran. The Shah was reinstated. The oil company was restructured so that American companies, including Exxon, Mobil, Gulf, Chevron, and Texaco, received a 40% stake in Iranian oil production. American oil companies, through an act of American government covert violence, had seized access to Iranian oil. The Shah's brutal suppression of political opposition, enabled by American support, eventually produced the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which produced the hostage crisis, which produced the conditions that fed the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, which fed the conditions that gave birth to Al-Qaeda's calculation that attacking America on its own soil was both possible and necessary. The thread from the CIA's 1953 operation in Tehran to the morning of September 11, 2001, and from September 11th to the roughly $2 trillion the United States has spent in the Middle East since, runs through a single word: oil. Quick question: how many gallons of gas do you think the average American uses in a year? Drop your guess in the comments. I'll tell you the answer before this video is over, and it's going to put everything you just heard in a very specific light. The internal combustion engine changed everything, but it didn't change everything all at once. It changed everything slowly, and then all at the same time. Carl Benz built the first gasoline-powered automobile in Germany in the 1880s. In 1908, Henry Ford launched the Model T in Detroit, Michigan. By 1920, there were more than 8 million registered cars in the United States. By 1930, more than 23 million. By 1960, more than 60 million. Every single one of them ran on gasoline. Every gallon of gasoline required roughly 1.5 gallons of crude oil to produce, once refining waste was accounted for. The automobile industry and the oil industry did not just grow together. They were the same organism. The United States was the center of this transformation. American car companies, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, were selling vehicles at a scale no other country could match. The interstate highway system, authorized by President Eisenhower in 1956, created 47,000 miles of highway across 50 states, a road network that laid end-to-end would circle the earth nearly twice. Every mile of that highway was built to move cars. Every car ran on oil. The infrastructure of American daily life, suburbia, the commute, the drive-through, the road trip, the entire logic of how American cities are designed, was built around cheap, abundant petroleum. American oil companies were the dominant players in global production for most of the 20th century. The Seven Sisters, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, BP, Chevron, Gulf Oil, and Texaco controlled roughly 85% of the world's oil reserves in the 1950s. They set prices. They negotiated with governments. They wrote the contracts. They decided which wells got drilled and which didn't. The 1973 oil embargo changed America in ways that are still being felt. When OPEC cut off oil exports to the United States in response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, gas prices quadrupled in months. Americans waited in lines stretching around the block at stations running dry. The national speed limit was dropped to 55 miles per hour. Thermostats were turned down in federal buildings. The president went on television and asked Americans to skip Christmas lights to save energy. In Texas, bumper stickers appeared. "Let the bastards freeze in the dark." The country was fracturing between energy producers and energy consumers. One lasting consequence of 1973 was the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a network of salt caverns along the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, which first received crude oil in 1977. Today, it holds roughly 370 million barrels, the largest government-owned oil reserve in the world, built because America had learned in gasoline lines stretching around city blocks that it could be brought to its knees by something it couldn't produce enough of. For a moment in the late 1990s, it looked like the worst might be behind us. Prices were low, production was high, the economy was booming, clean energy was coming. It wasn't. What I haven't told you yet is what the people selling you oil right now already know, and have known for decades. Some of them have known it since before you were born. In 1977, a scientist named James Black gave a presentation to the senior leadership of Exxon Corporation at their headquarters in New York City. Black was one of Exxon's own researchers. He told them in plain terms that burning fossil fuels was adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and that the resulting warming could have, in his words, dramatic environmental effects within the next 50 years. He told them the science was not speculative. It was real, it was measurable, and it was being caused directly by the combustion of petroleum. Exxon's management did not dismiss him. They funded his research. Over the next several years, Exxon built one of the most sophisticated climate science programs in the private sector. They outfitted a supertanker, the Esso Atlantic, with instruments to measure CO2 absorption in the ocean. They ran sophisticated computer models of global climate. They published peer-reviewed research. By 1982, Exxon's own internal documents showed that their scientists had concluded, with high confidence, that burning fossil fuels was warming the planet, that the consequences would be severe, and that the window to act was closing. In 1982, Exxon's management made a decision. They classified the research. They circulated it internally with a note that it was not to be distributed externally. And then they began the project of making sure the public never found out what they already knew. This is the part that should make you angry. In 1989, the Global Climate Coalition was founded. Its members included Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, Ford, General Motors, and more than 50 other corporations from the energy and transportation industries. The coalition's explicit purpose, documented in internal memos that would eventually be made public, was to cast doubt on climate science, lobby against climate legislation in Congress, and undermine international agreements like the Kyoto Protocol. They funded think tanks that published reports questioning climate research. They placed dissenting scientists on television and in newspapers. They ran advertisements in major American papers claiming the science was uncertain. The science was not uncertain, not to them. The coalition's own internal documents, reviewed by the Union of Concerned Scientists, showed that member companies knew the science was settled while publicly claiming otherwise. It was, as a Columbia Journalism School analysis later put it, the tobacco playbook applied to the atmosphere. Create doubt, fund friendly research, attack critics, delay regulation for as long as possible. By their own internal projections, transitioning away from petroleum would cost the major oil companies hundreds of billions of dollars in stranded assets, wells, refineries, pipelines, and tankers that would become worthless if carbon regulations were enacted. A 1997 internal Exxon memo explicitly discussed strategies for stalling international climate negotiations at Kyoto. American lawyers reviewed those strategies. American executives signed off on them. The US Senate voted 95-0 against ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, 95-0. The oil industry spent more than $115 million lobbying Congress on energy and climate policy between 1998 and 2005 alone. The FDA was not empowered to act. Congress knew. The White House, across multiple administrations, both parties, knew, and they kept it quiet. This wasn't a foreign problem. This happened in American boardrooms with American lawyers signing off on it in the most powerful country on earth. The mechanism of the cover-up was American in its specificity. It ran through universities, think tanks, regulatory agencies, and the revolving door between the oil industry and the federal government. Lee Raymond, the CEO of Exxon from 1993 to 2005, the period during which the Global Climate Coalition was most active, went on to chair the National Petroleum Council, an advisory body to the US Secretary of Energy after his retirement. Rex Tillerson, Raymond's successor at Exxon, became the United States Secretary of State in 2017. The line between the boardroom and the cabinet was not a line. It was a hallway. The American Petroleum Institute, the primary trade lobby for US. Oil and gas spent decades funding research designed to introduce uncertainty into the climate debate. A 1998 API memo, leaked to the press, outlined a plan to recruit and train scientists, produce classroom materials, and place op-eds in American newspapers specifically to challenge climate science. The memo described success as recognition by previously unpersuaded science writers, policymakers, and leaders in the business community. This wasn't research. It was a communications strategy disguised as research, and it worked in American classrooms, American newspapers, and American policy debates for more than 2 decades. The unraveling began not with a regulator, but with journalism and litigation. In 2015, Reporters at Inside Climate News, a Pulitzer Prize-winning American publication, obtained Exxon's internal documents from the 1970s and 1980s through interviews with former employees and painstaking document research. The Los Angeles Times published its own investigation simultaneously. What they found was exactly what the documents showed. Exxon's scientists had confirmed the reality of climate change. Exxon's management had decided to hide it, and Exxon had spent the following decades funding the organizations that denied it. New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman opened a fraud investigation into Exxon in 2015 under state securities law, arguing Exxon had misled investors about the financial risks of climate change. Massachusetts, California, and other states followed. More than a dozen U.S. cities and counties, including Baltimore, Honolulu, and Boulder, Colorado, have active lawsuits against oil companies for costs related to climate damage. Here are the American numbers that matter right now. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that the United States experienced 28 separate weather events in 2023 where damage exceeded $1 billion each. The total economic damage from those events, roughly $92 billion in a single year. The cumulative cost of climate-related disasters in the United States from 1980 to 2023 exceeds $2.6 trillion. That is not a global number. That is the American number. What American taxpayers, American homeowners, and American insurers have paid, because the warming that Exxon scientists confirmed in 1982 has been proceeding unaddressed for 40 more years. Over 40 million Americans today live in counties at high risk from climate-related flooding, wildfire, or extreme heat events directly linked to fossil fuel combustion. That's more people than live in the entire states of Texas and Florida combined. Healthcare costs from air pollution produced by petroleum combustion, ground-level ozone, particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, run to an estimated $800 billion per year in the United States, according to research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. American families in coastal Louisiana are watching their land disappear into the Gulf of Mexico, land eroding partly because the oil industry's canal systems disrupted the Mississippi River Delta that used to replenish the coast. American families in towns from rural Pennsylvania to the Gulf Coast discovered what it looks like when the people responsible for protecting you decide that protecting you costs too much. Exxon scientists knew. 1982, they knew. And the industry kept going for more than 40 years while Americans paid the price. At the gas pump, in their healthcare bills, in their insurance premiums, and in the towns and coastlines disappearing because of a decision made in a boardroom in New York City that nobody ever put to a public vote. The United States is the largest oil producer on Earth. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, the United States. Since the shale revolution of the 2000s, the widespread deployment of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, American oil production has more than doubled. As of 2023, the U.S. produces more than 13 million barrels of oil per day. The Permian Basin in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico alone produces more oil than Iraq. American oil production today is higher than it has ever been in history. And that number from the comments question earlier. The average American uses roughly 3 gallons of oil products per day, every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's the equivalent of filling a large kitchen trash bag with petroleum products for every man, woman, and child in this country every single day. You'll find oil at Walmart, not labeled as oil, but present in every piece of plastic packaging in the store. The synthetic rubber soles of your shoes. The polyester fibers in your clothing, the adhesive in your tape, the wax on your apples. Oil is in your pantry right now. in the plastic wrap around your cheese, in the bottle holding your ketchup, in the container your yogurt came in. It's in the tires of every car, in every parking lot, in every city in America, and in the asphalt under those cars. McDonald's alone burns through enormous quantities of petroleum before a single burger reaches your table. In the plastic packaging, the diesel trucks that deliver the food, the petroleum-based fertilizers and pesticides used to grow the beef and the potatoes, the synthetic oils in the fryers. The American food system is, in a very real sense, a petroleum delivery system that produces food as a byproduct. It's in your gas tank. It's in your medicine cabinet. Petroleum derivatives appear in everything from ibuprofen capsule coatings to antibiotic ointments to the plastic of the bottles themselves. And it's in the air you're breathing right now if you live anywhere near a highway, because particulate matter from combustion engines doesn't stop at city limits. Slow down for a second. A black liquid seeping out of the ground in Pennsylvania. An ancient fuel the Seneca people collected from the surface of creeks for centuries before any European arrived. A substance that was, for most of human history, little more than a curiosity and a sealant. That substance now underlies the infrastructure of American daily life so completely that removing it from the picture isn't just difficult. It is, for most Americans living most American lives, practically unimaginable. Your house, the way it was built, sits where it sits because cheap oil made it possible to build suburbs far from city centers and commute to work. Your job, the way the economy works, depends on supply chains that run on diesel. Your food, the way it's grown, processed and delivered, is a petroleum-intensive industrial operation from the moment the seed goes in the ground to the moment the package lands on your porch. You didn't design any of this, you inherited it. And the companies that built it, that lobbied to keep it in place, that funded the think tanks and bought the senators and classified the research, are still operating, still profitable, still spending money to make sure it stays this way. If you're sitting there thinking this sounds like every other industry you've ever heard of, you're right. This is the pattern. This is how it always goes. A resource is discovered, a small number of people gain control of it. They use that control to shape the laws, the infrastructure, the culture, and the political system around their interests. By the time the public understands what happened, the structure is so embedded that dismantling it seems more disruptive than living with it. How many things in your life right now were built on a decision someone made in a boardroom that you never got to vote on? Take a second with that. The gap between what America says it believes in, free markets, transparency, informed citizens making informed choices, and what actually happened with oil is the gap between the American ideal and the American reality. The Rockefellers and the Exxons didn't break the rules. They wrote them, and they wrote them in a country that celebrated exactly that kind of initiative, right up until the moment the consequences became too expensive to ignore. We're at that moment now. The consequences are on the invoice. Americans are paying it in pieces, in higher insurance premiums, in disaster recovery costs, in the price of a gallon of gas that still hasn't fully accounted for everything that went into getting it to the pump. The story of oil is the story of how America was built. And it's still being written. In every energy bill in Congress, every climate lawsuit working its way through the courts, every electric vehicle charging overnight in a driveway in Ohio or Texas or California. Those are all chapters in the same story. It hasn't ended, and the people still writing it include you, whether you think of yourself that way or not. Here's a question I want you to sit with. The next time you pull into a gas station, and you will probably within the next 72 hours, are you going to think about where that gallon actually came from? Not the refinery, not the tanker, I mean really, the war that was fought for it, the government that was overthrown for it, the science that was buried for it, the coastline that was sacrificed for it. Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me what you knew going in and what surprised you. I read every single one, and the best ones genuinely shape what I cover next. You're not just watching, you're part of what this channel is building. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that run your life, told straight, without filler, subscribe. Every subscriber helps this channel reach more people who deserve to know this stuff. People who are tired of being handed the surface version of everything. Hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it tells me you want to keep going deeper. Turn on notifications. The next story is already in the works, and you won't want to come in on it late. And share this with someone who thinks they already know how the world works. Show them what they missed. Here's what I want to leave you with. Oil started as a black liquid seeping out of the ground in Pennsylvania, collected by the Seneca people with blankets. It became the reason the CIA overthrew a democracy in 1953, the reason Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the reason 383 Americans didn't come home from the Persian Gulf, the reason Exxon scientists filed a report in 1982, watched it get classified, and watched the world keep burning anyway. It runs through the pipeline of American life so completely that most of us have never once stopped to ask who decided it should be this way. Somebody did. They decided it in boardrooms and in Senate hearing rooms and in memos that said not for external distribution. They decided it for you, and they decided it before most of you were born. The next time you stop at a Chevron or an Exxon or a Shell and put the nozzle in your tank, you'll know exactly whose decisions you're paying for, and you'll never be able to unknow it.